What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for God of War, specifically, of course, the rebooted version. Obviously, I'm a bit late to the party on this one, but I primarily play PC, so this wasn't even on Steam until a few months ago, so here we are. Nonetheless, I primarily play things like CRPGs or just more RPG things in general, so I wanted to take a break a bit and review an action-oriented title for once before we jump back into Mass Effect 2 next. To get some other things out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time. It does mean more than just the achievements. If you go to my channel and you're not subscribed, first thing you'll see is a video explaining all of that. And while I do think the achievement list for a game like this is actually pretty solid, the one thing that it really doesn't include at all are difficulty achievements, so just getting all of the achievements doesn't tell you much about the difficulty the game was played on. But I ran through the game 100% on normal, and then I ran through it again on God of War difficulty. Or Give Me God of War difficulty, as it's called. Let's start right there with the difficulty of the game. You have a few different options, basically story, normal, hard, or Give Me God of War. The first three can be changed whenever in-game without any consequences. It does not matter. Give Me God of War does require you to play the game on that difficulty, period. If you want to change it, you have to start a new game. Now, from my experience, I would not recommend to Give Me God of War until you hit New Game Plus, which is a thing you can do, as that difficulty is a bit of a nightmare even on New Game Plus when you have all the abilities, etc. available to you. So something to keep in mind. But in terms of what you get for Give Me God of War difficulty, there are actually 2 shield skins that you can get specifically for beating the game on that difficulty, but that's literally it. There's no achievement, there's nothing else story-wise really that happens. That difficulty is just there if you love the game and want the challenge. But again, you do get a couple of unique shield skins if you beat it. However, you don't actually see your shield in-game that often, or at least not the front of it, so that reward is kind of perplexing. But in addition to those things, if you beat the game on New Game Plus, or if you just play through New Game Plus, you can actually get a few unique pieces of armor that are the best in the game, really, for you and Atreus, your son, which we'll talk about. But from there, let's talk story setup. So we are, of course, playing as Kratos, living in the realm of Midgard as a man. In the years since killing Zeus, Kratos had taken on a wife and had his son, Atreus. Now, we join Kratos and Atreus as they are actually preparing a funeral pyre for Kratos' now deceased wife. The primary plot for the game, actually, is that you and Atreus are carrying her ashes to the top of the highest mountain in all the realms to spread her ashes. Kratos, of course, being a god of war, which Atreus does not initially know about, naturally comes into conflict with the Aesir gods, or the Nordic pantheon, Odin, Thor, all of them. And without spoiling it, that's about as much as we're going to talk about the story. But with the sequel, God of War Ragnarok, coming up, we get to see the fabled Ragnarok event of the Nordic pantheon, which obviously will involve Kratos and Atreus in some fashion. Since we only play as Kratos, let's talk a little bit about progression and how that works. With your first run through the game, you're going to be getting things like health and rage upgrades by opening special chests that you'll find throughout the world. In a mostly similar manner, we can pick up runic attacks for our axe and later our chaos blades. These are essentially interchangeable special attacks for each type of weapon. Once you use them, they'll go on cooldown, which can be affected by stats on your gear, so you can quicken up the cooldown of these things if you have the appropriate gear to do so. And for each weapon, you can have a light runic attack and a heavy runic attack. In total, you get about 4 of these, and they can all be kind of interspersed to use them pretty frequently, combined with the normal upgrade paths for all of your weapons. In addition to all of those things, we actually also have skills. So as we kill enemies, complete quests, etc., we'll earn XP, and then we spend that XP on various skills. These will do things like unlock extra combo attacks, parrying an attack and then following it up immediately with a counterattack, as well as actually getting Atreus more involved in the combat himself. He will have skills associated with him that allow him to do more and be an active participant in combat as well. And then on top of all of that stuff, we still have our gear. So in this particular RPG, Kratos has a pretty robust selection of gear. Now, I would tell you by the time you get to New Game Plus, there's really only a handful of sets that you're likely to be using. So while the initial middle part of the game actually has a lot of variety in what you can do gear-wise. The in-game kind of revolves around one of a few different sets that you're more than likely going to be using. And these sets do offer some variance to your playstyle. Some of them will come with effects that change your rage ability, that type of stuff. But what starts as a seemingly big system of gear kind of boils down to just a few pieces, really. But your gear can be enchanted as well, so you'll have things like that. You can equip various grips on your axe and chaos blades to change how they function a little bit. You can have a talisman as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of character progression, surprisingly. But as interesting as all of that is, what I like the most in terms of the combat progression is actually Atreus. So as you play through the game, Atreus becomes more and more accustomed to combat as he is what appears to be like maybe a preteen. And he starts the game being pretty skittish in this regard, but by the late game, he's actually actively involved in like the melee combat, if you will, stunning enemies for you, setting up combos for you, that type of stuff, as well as shooting his bow into enemies. And he's a pretty essential part of the combat by the late game, but I really enjoyed how they started him out being very skittish and kind of afraid to jump in to being much more actively involved. I thought that was a really cool touch, especially since a big part of the story revolves around these two growing closer together. To see that actually play out in gameplay terms was really cool. And speaking of gameplay, let's talk about the gameplay and the world building. Playing through this game reminded me a lot of Darksiders 2 actually, in that you have several pretty big hubs that you can kind of explore from, and I wouldn't really call them open world by any stretch, as you'll essentially have a large explorable area and then you'll go into little side areas, if you will, that are dungeons, but it's all kind of done seamlessly without too many loading screens, that type of stuff. Our primary hub is Midgard, but later throughout the game we'll be able to travel to other realms such as Muspelheim, Niflheim, Elfheim, and as the game progresses and Atreus picks up new abilities, as well as you picking up new abilities, you'll be able to explore more and more of the areas. So there's a bit of backtracking to go back and get everything if you're interested in that type of thing. But a lot of this sees you solving environmental puzzles with the various abilities that you're given. And in addition to those things, we can take on a handful of fun side quests. I think in total there's literally like 12. Surprisingly, with these being as few as they are, they're very handcrafted, I would say. They all kind of serve a purpose as either explorations of the lore surrounding the Norse gods, at least this iteration of it, as well as Kratos teaching Atreus life lessons, as this journey is as much about Kratos being a father to his son as it is about the combat you would expect from a God of War title. More than anything, I wanted to say that this game did side content very, very well. And what can seem like a simple go in, find it, and get it, usually has a lot of dialogue about teaching Atreus how to do things and confronting the world, that type of stuff. So even mundane tasks were made interesting by the dialogue and lessons being imparted onto Atreus. In addition to those things, though, we see all manner of collectibles and challenges. Personally, I think this game went a little heavy on the collectibles for what is primarily a combat-oriented title. Depending on exactly what you want to count as a collectible, it's in the ballpark of a couple hundred. But in addition to those things, we also have optional challenges like the Valkyries, which serve as like the ultimate combat challenge. The Valkyries are the hardest combat encounters in the game. More than any of them, specifically their leader, Sigrun, is kind of the ultimate challenge to test your abilities against, and she remains pretty challenging regardless of what difficulty you have the game on, but obviously much more difficult on Give Me God of War. Now, despite having a lot to do and a lot of collectibles to track down, later in the game you do eventually get access to fast travel. Initially, when you first encounter the fast travel system, you can only travel back from where you are from specific points to one specific place in Midgard. Late game, however, you can just take fast travel points to other fast travel points to move around much faster, which can help getting the collectibles, etc. less of a slog than the initial appearance. But that said, what would a God of War game be without the combat? Because as fun and interesting as the exploration is, especially the conversations with Atreus, let's be real, this is God of War. It's primarily a combat action game. So, as you might imagine, the combat is primarily supposed to be a power fantasy, which I think makes the very interesting case for playing on story mode. Because I would tell you that you're supposed to be Kratos, the God of War. So, getting murdered on Give Me God of War difficulty against basic mobs can be a little jarring. As such, I think playing on story mode kind of leans into the fact that you're supposed to be playing a god a little more, but that's a conversation for another time. Combat is robust, as you would imagine it would be be. So combined with all the runic attacks and everything, kind of changing up how you play and weaving combos together, allowing you to kind of pick a play style in some instances, down to the weapon you use or the combos you like to resort to, that type of thing. I think the primary things to know about combat can be down to a few things. On higher difficulties, a great feel for the parrying system will go a long way for you. So sometimes enemies will flash yellow before they attack you, and if you time it right, you can block that attack and parry it to counterattack. However, if you just block, those yellow circle attacks will actually just break your block, which can then leave you vulnerable to follow-up attacks if there are other enemies or if that enemy just has a follow-up attack, which is mixed in some cases. Now, if enemies flash with a red circle, that is an attack you cannot block and you need to dodge out of the way of it. In addition to those things, we have basic elemental damage types to consider. There are 3 elemental damage types: frost, fire, and thunder. Or lightning, whatever you want to call it. Now, nothing in the game is really immune to thunder or lightning, so Atreus is going to be the one dealing this. He can get shock arrows later in the game, and he can use them, and again, nothing is really immune to these. Even bosses that you think would be are not. If you see an enemy that is glowing blue, it is almost guaranteed to be immune to your frost axe, which means you either have to use your bare hands, which have a high stun chance and is a very viable way to play, or you have to use the chaos blades when you get them about halfway through the game. Alternatively, if you see something glowing red, it might be immune to your chaos blades, though that is much more rare. There are a lot of glowing red enemies, but only a handful of them are actually immune to chaos blade damage, which is a bit strange, but it does come up occasionally, but much less frequently than the frost immune enemies. So in terms of just things to know about combat, I would say the damage type immunities as well as the parrying system are probably the most important things to learn. And beyond that, it comes down to just really how you want to play the game and model Kratos. Combat, while it can feel very satisfying and power fantasy-esque, as well as brutal and weighty, I love the animations in this game as a side note, but I do think the combat runs into a couple of problems. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of gear that you can equip. And this means a lot of that gear is tied to specific stats. Things like increasing the power of your runic attacks, increasing the cooldown of those runic attacks, strength, which is just raw damage you deal, and vitality, defenses, things like that. And while this perfectly makes sense for you, for enemies, this is represented by a difficulty number as well as their health bar. So the color of an enemy's health bar will give you an idea of how strong they are relative to you, and also the number next to their nameplate will give you an indication of their overall power level. And this is a fine system overall, but I would tell you that enemies have stats as well, which means that some of them do not react to your hits the same way as other enemies, even though they're the same type of enemy, if that makes sense. Like one might be a power level 7 and one might be like a power level 8. And that power level 8 is going to react to your hits differently than the power level 7. This is primarily because one of the stats, I believe it's vitality, dictates the reaction to your hits, which is fine overall, but in a very fast-paced game like this, I found that an enemy that is basically the same as several other enemies that you are surrounded by suddenly reacting differently to the hits that you're performing, despite looking identical to other enemies of the same type, can be a little jarring, and it can kind of make you feel like the game cheated you a little bit, even though that's not what happened. It technically just had different stats, but it's not like I can readily identify that in a very fast-paced action game, so I fully admit that might just be more of a me thing than anything else. And on lower difficulties, it's certainly not noticeable, but on the Give Me God of War difficulty, it was something I noticed very often. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention combat-wise that kind of gets a little dull is that there's really only a handful of enemy types, and you're going to be fighting them over probably 30 to 40 hours for a first run-through, which gets pretty old pretty quick. Combine that with the fact that even the different enemies are usually about the same size as the other enemies, and usually only have like a color variance for the most part. And you just kind of lose track of the enemies being just the same thing. They all just feel very similar outside of like the big cinematic boss fights. However, eventually you're going to beat the story, you're going to get access to all your abilities, etc. And you can actually continue playing the game after the story, which is when you might take on all of the in-game challenges that I wanted to talk about. This primarily comes down to 2 realms and the Valkyries. So in-game content, outside of just going and getting all the collectibles, etc., comes down to Muspelheim, which is a series of trials in the Fire Realm, Niflheim, which is a sort of roguelite adventure, which is kind of strange, and then the Valkyries. Valkyries are the easiest to explain. Later in the game, you can access them through hidden chambers. They are the toughest boss fights in the game. They are sort of tiered, though. Like 4 of them are easier than the other 4, and then the Valkyrie Queen, Sigrun, the 9th one, is the hardest by far. And usually these fights require a mastery of a system of some sort on your part, be that masterful parrying, ability to deal with multiple enemies at once, that type of stuff. But usually each individual Valkyrie fight will test your mastery of a system, and then the Valkyrie Queen is a sort of be-all, end-all combat challenge. Then we have Muspelheim. These are a series of trials that will test your ability to handle various types of enemies. Now you have to go through the normal and hard version of these trials to reach one of the Valkyries. After that, a third set of trials opens up, which is even harder than the last, and it's just sort of an in-game activity you can participate in for something to do. And then there is Niflheim. This is a weird one. Basically, you're put into an area where you are slowly being killed via a timer, so if the timer reaches 0, you die, or at least you start to die, your health goes down. And you have to run through this fog, fight a bunch of enemies, collect a currency called Mist Echoes that you can then spend on opening treasure, which will then lead to some more fights, which can get you some special gear. Overall, pretty cool. Of the 2, I liked Muspelheim more than Niflheim. But that said, that is pretty much everything you can expect from the rebooted God of War. So let's talk positives and negatives. Positives. The story for this game is incredible. I loved it. This might just be the fact that these days I myself am a father and no longer a teenager. I think when I was 17, this story probably would not have resonated with me much at all. But these days, as a father just shy of 30, I can relate to a story about someone changing and trying to connect with their son. So I think I kind of was the person the story was aimed at, to be honest. And unsurprisingly, I loved it. It's a deep and moving story in an otherwise combat-focused game that I genuinely wasn't expecting. The other positives, in my opinion, were the approach to difficulty in general. I like how they kind of leave it wide open. And I like how the story kind of serves story mode. So if everything's easy for you, it's like, yeah, you're the God of War. It's supposed to be. But on the other end of the spectrum, you might want that high-end challenge. And I just like the diversity of difficulty options. I thought that was a nice touch. And one more positive is just that the cinematic feel of everything is really cool. You're fighting these giant fantasy monsters. Everything feels incredibly brutal, but somehow whimsical at the same time. And the tone and just overall presentation of the setting I thought was masterfully done. But nonetheless, there are some negatives. As I mentioned, the enemy repetition got pretty old pretty quick, and then as I also mentioned, the gear system seems much broader in the beginning, but then narrows down to like a couple different sets. And those sets have big impacts on your playstyle, but I kind of would have just preferred being able to pick between those and not bother with the sort of gear overload you get towards the beginning of the game, which then ceases to matter by the time you get to the end game. But for me personally, that's really all I've got for a negative. So in conclusion, if any of this sounds interesting to you, it's a surprisingly fantastic game for what I would have considered just a regular action title. I wasn't expecting it to be as good as it actually was, despite all the great things I had heard about it. But after experiencing it for myself, yeah, it's truly a great game, especially the story. Now, I would tell you there's always a flip side of that. I think there are some people who are going to see this story and just not care much about it, or it just won't be for them, that type of thing. Or they might just not like action games. But I will tell you that if this seems like the kind of thing you would enjoy, in my opinion, it is well worth it. You can actually pick it up for just $50 on Steam as a base price. It does occasionally go on sale. It's actually on sale at the time of this video for, I believe it's through July 7th for like 20% off, so you can actually get it for $40. But again, overall, a truly great game that I enjoyed a great deal, despite it not being the normal type of game I would typically play. And while I absolutely had some negatives to point out, I think in the face of how well done everything else about the title was, they're pretty insignificant, to be honest. So, all of that said, hope you guys enjoyed the video, enjoyed the review. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that typical YouTube jazz. We are growing every day. I put out reviews and list-style videos pretty regularly, if that's up your alley at all. But regardless of all that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.